welcome to the continuation of our cover cropping opportunities in specialty crops webinar series, and we'll be also hopefully soon be putting on some virtual site visit videos on the YouTube channel as well. This is a collaboration of Contra Costa County's Resource Conservation District and the UC Cooperative Extension programs, my program in East Bay Crop Production and the Bay Area Urban Agriculture program as well. In this Zoom webinar format, we don't get the intimacy of an in-room meeting, but we can do some things. So if you have a chance to introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be great, both to us and to one another. So my name is Kamyar Aram. I'm the East Bay Specialty Crops Advisor, and welcome to the webinar. Today we have another great University of California Cooperative Extension expert in cover crops. We're grateful to have Sarah Light with us, who will present on managing cover crops in annual cropping systems. And then we'll have a question and answer session. Please use the question and answer feature that you'll see at the on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes it shows up if you put your cursor over it. And you can please pose your questions. Even you can pose your questions while Sarah's presenting, but we'll wait until she's done to I will be reading through them and she'll be answering them for us. So before we get started and I fully introduce Sarah, I'm going to introduce your other hosts here. Pass it to Rob first.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Benetton. I work with UC Cooperative Extension as the Bay Area Urban Ag Advisor. And then I'm going to pass the mic on to Derek.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Emmons. I'm the Agriculture Conservation Coordinator with Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. Popcorn Julio.
Buenos días, saludos everyone. My name is Julio Contreras. I'm a community education specialist with UC Cooperative Extension, Alameda Urban Ag and Food Systems Program. I'll pass it on to Ben.
And last but not least, my name is Ben Weiss, and I'm with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. I'm the Agriculture Conservation Manager. If you hear anything today that you're interested in implementing on your own farm, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my contact information here in the chat, and we'll talk a little bit later about some other opportunities that are coming up. And I guess I'll pass it back to Kamyar.
Can't hear you.
Oh, we appear to have lost your audio, Kamyar.
Yeah, sorry, I turned my microphone off. So I was just saying that, yeah, at the end you'll also get a survey to evaluate this webinar, and please fill that out. It helps us just kind of improve our programming to better serve you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah Light, who is the University of California Cooperative Extension Agronomy Advisor in Sutter County, also serving Yuba and Colusa counties. Her research and extension program focuses on field crops, but also extensive work on cover crops, in particular in annual cropping systems. She is a member of the Western Cover Crop Council, and she's the chair for the Southwest Regional Committee. Sarah earned her master's degrees in soil science and plant pathology in a dual degree program at Oregon State University. And before that, before starting as a farm advisor in 2017, she also worked for the USDA on biochar research. However, Sarah is originally from the Bay Area, from our own area here, and she worked at urban farms and gardens before her graduate studies. She also has a BS in Latin American studies and is fluent in Spanish. So quite an interesting background, and we're very grateful to have you, Sarah.
Thanks for
I
having
will
me.
stop sharing and pass it on to you.
Okay, great. I just added a slide based on the question I saw in the Q&A, so.
Nice, nimble work.
Can everybody see these okay in the full screen presenter format? Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm excited. I'm gonna minimize everyone's video so that I can see my slides. So I won't be able to see you if you're waving at me, but hopefully everything will go great. So I'm gonna talk today about cover crops in annual cropping systems. Thank you so much for that great introduction. This is a picture of a little wasp with its little wasp nest on a pea plant that I found in one of my cover crop plots last year. We have a lot of habitat for insects and other organisms in cover crops, especially when you consider that those fields would be fallow if the cover crop was not there in an annual system. And I think, in particular with things like birds, we sometimes think about them living in trees, but actually field crops are one of the biggest habitats for a lot of that type of macrofauna. So having kind of continuous cover and opportunities, I've even found bird nests in triticale plots, and so it's just really great for the whole ecosystem. So just to quickly kind of reconnect cover cropping back to soil health, I think part of the reason that there's a renewed interest in cover crops is because of this idea of soil health and the connection between soil and our climate change goals. Actually, cover crops were quite popular before the Haber-Bosch process or synthetic nitrogen fixation was possible. But then when we had the opportunity to fertilize our crops with synthetic fertilizer, we didn't have the same necessity to do cover cropping. So now it's coming kind of back into favor with soil health and some of the other benefits that we're seeing besides the nutrient content. So soil health is the connection between the physical, the chemical, and the biological, and it's really here in this star in the middle. And one thing I want to highlight from this definition of soil health being the continued capacity of the soil to function is this word, to function. To function as a verb is to work or operate in a proper or particular way, to be in working or running order, to perform, to play the role of, to do the duty as. So really, we are asking soil to do certain work for us. We need soil to do certain jobs for agriculture, for gardening, and also for society at large. We also can refer to those sometimes as ecosystem services. Those are including, but not limited to, this is a pretty short list. I'm not biased at all because I'm a soil scientist about the wonders and abundance of the world of soil. So, this is definitely true. Soil provides space for roots to grow and to breathe. It allows water to infiltrate. It moves water rapidly through the profile. We may be thinking about that now with the flash flood risks following the fires. In certain areas, soil is really a big mover of water, large quantities of water. We need it to store water for later. We need it to provide habitat for our soil organisms, and we need it to provide nutrients for plant uptake. So this is a picture of soil, just to kind of think about what we're talking about when we're seeing these dark spaces here. These are open pore spaces where air is filled, and we can see these roots growing here. There's probably an abundance of microorganisms in this soil. It's really teeming with life. So some of the potential benefits of cover cropping specifically is that it can help to improve soil structure, which allows water to infiltrate better, water to move better through the profile. It can provide nitrogen for subsequent crops when it either fixes nitrogen or pulls nitrogen from a deeper part of the soil profile. So plants are limited in terms of where they can feed in the profile based on where their roots are. And so some of our commodities have more shallow roots as compared to some of our cover crops like brassicas and grasses that might have deeper roots and can pull that nitrogen from depth. We call that mining nitrogen. And then when it's back into the biomass on top of the soil, we incorporate it and it's available again at the top of the profile. Cover crops can increase soil organic matter, which is food for our microbes. They feed on carbon. They can provide habitat for beneficial insects, as I talked about in my introduction slide. They can suppress weeds, improve accessibility. This is kind of when we have improved water infiltration, less ponding, our soil is perhaps more readily allowable for us to get in there and work it for a subsequent cash crop. They can also reduce soil erosion, nitrogen leaching, and pest and disease pressure. Now, there are challenges to using cover crops as well. Cover crops can also increase disease and pest pressure in certain contexts. So to kind of connect again to soil health, this is surface compaction. So this is what happens when we really work our ground and then it rains. The rain will kind of collapse the aggregates and our soil particles become like this crust on top. This is very problematic because the plant, sometimes the seed can't actually get like out of the soil. I was just at a wheat field last week that had an issue like this where it looked like the geese had eaten a lot of the plants down, but they had actually only eaten the plants that had emerged. And when you would dig down under this kind of compacted layer, there was a little seedling there that was like in a crinkled position, unable to get out of there. So because cover crops will break the fall of the rain during the rainy months, they prevent this surface compaction. And as well, they provide residue and just kind of more organic matter that can improve soil structure. This is soil erosion. This is taken from my work truck. And so this is kind of like, think about the Dust Bowl on a much smaller scale. So when we have residue or cover crops there, it's just holding the soil into place and we're not losing it. Topsoil is one of our most valuable natural resources, and it is what we all rely on for our food every day. So we can't lose it. And it takes about 500 years for a new inch of soil to form. So we can't really risk losing this resource. Okay, so to jump specifically into managing cover crops and to selecting them, when we're selecting cover crops, and I know we have like a mixed crowd here with different size producers, both commercial producers as well as more garden scale. So I'm happy to answer questions as I'm able about all systems. I'll try to keep the talk relevant to everybody, but I do work mostly in larger systems for now. So most of the data I'll show will be from that. But with regards to variety selection, we can think either of the season that we want to plant. So in an annual system, we're planting when our fields or our garden is empty. This would be a prime time of year to have cover crops in the ground in a summer annual system if you were going into tomatoes or something like that. But if you were growing wheat or like garbanzos or another kind of winter annual, you would plant your cover crop in the summer. And I'll talk a little bit about what I've seen for both those seasons being done in my area. Variety selection can include plant family. That kind of depends on what your objective is, your purpose and the cost benefit, and then just kind of the practical considerations around, you know, are you going to be able to irrigate? How much do you want to have to incorporate that biomass? How much biomass can you manage? What pests have you had in your field? And how much do you want to spend on seed? So they're just kind of different considerations. But I would say as a general rule of thumb, having a living root in the soil at all, as much of the year as possible, preferably all times of year if possible, having our soil covered year round. And those are really the tenements, two of the big tenements of soil health. There are others, but cover crops will provide those benefits regardless of the variety. So these are two pictures from some of my research trials. You can see the buttes in the background in both. That's kind of how we can orient ourselves in the area in which I work with the Sutter buttes. This one on the left is a vetch field, and then we can see there's some weeds there, but also a lot of volunteer wheat kind of popping up. Specifically around here, we see this voluntary wheat. It's already going to seed. So this is like a really nice big stand soon before termination. And then this picture here on the bottom right is a picture that I actually took on Monday in the field of one of my trials. This is mustard, and then this is triticale on the left, and I also have a safflower plot as the third treatment here, and it's not nearly as big. And so sometimes when you even select the perfect varieties and you plant them at the right time of year, you don't get any rain and the plants are stressed. I'm really optimistic that with the rain that we're going to be getting this week, the rain we just got, and then the warm weather, that these will kind of be off to the races. But that is one of the challenges for sure in our area that, you know, it's hard to work around. I wanted to share this resource that I put together with my colleague Amber Vinkasey Ball. She's a veg crop advisor here. She's also an entomologist. And we had a 3-year trial that we just finished last year, and we put these single row variety trials out. And we had this great field day planned. Of course, it was 2 days after the shelter in place ordinance last March, so we had to unfortunately cancel it. So we were able to put together this resource now that everyone can access. But if you are interested in seeing how some of these common grasses, legumes, and brassicas did perform in 1 year in the Sacramento Valley, please visit it. We tried to really kind of document what the roots looked like, what the biomass looked like, take average heights. We took biomass and processed them at the lab to get pounds of carbon and nitrogen per acre. And then we did percent cover with bare soil, weeds, and cover crop. Of course, bare soil is what we really don't want from a soil health perspective. Weeds is what we don't want from an agronomic or cash crop production perspective. And then the cover crop in terms of how much kind of potential good biomass we're going to be able to put back in. Of course, weeds in some case can serve as a cover crop, especially if they don't go to seed. The risk with weeds is that they do go to seed, you increase your population, and you're not able to terminate in time. But there are studies that kind of show in terms of water movement and that stuff that's weeds, weeds are still soil cover. But then of course you just don't want to introduce more weeds or pests into your system. I do have 7 locations where I've replicated this year in the Sacramento Valley. I'll be emailing out the map this week. And if you're interested, you can contact me. I'm glad just to share the locations and you can stop by at your leisure. I will say they do not look that good right now, but I'm hoping that they will look better soon with the weather. And then I also just wanted to make a quick plug for the NRCS Plant Materials Center in Lockford. They do this type of variety trial demonstration. I don't know if they're doing it during COVID, but they were doing it every year for summer and winter crops. And it's pretty close to Contra Costa County. It's just right across the Delta, and they're an excellent source of information and resources for variety selection. They've been doing many, many years of this kind of variety trials, and we're pretty lucky to have them so close to us in Northern California because they're our only location for the whole state. So typically there are 3 kind of main families that we think about with cover crops, legumes, grasses, and brassicas, or sometimes we have plants that have mixtures between those. In terms of legumes, this is a pea in this particular picture. Legumes will fix nitrogen through a symbiotic relationship with rhizobia bacteria. The bacteria come into the root nodules and they like the carbon, so they take the carbon out of the roots and they are able to fix the nitrogen into these cute little nodules. I'll talk about that a little more later. It is important to inoculate your seeds, especially the first time you plant a legume species in that field, to make sure that you have the right strain of rhizobia bacteria so that they can kind of do that work for you. Legumes break down rapidly. So if you're worried about biomass and not having a ton of residue, they're pretty quick. They can be pretty variable in biomass, and in my experience, they can really change rapidly. I'll show some data later about what the difference a month makes for a vetch crop, but really they can really take off to the races when it warms up and they have moisture. They can be cold sensitive. I'm seeing that in some of my demo plots where they either like germinated and didn't come through the soil, or they germinated and it finally got wet and then it got really cold and they just didn't like it. But so you can have some risks with stands in our climate, but that's with a lot of our commodities and an uncertain water future. And they can provide beneficial insect habitat like other cover crops can as well. This is this one particular pea and kind of just a close-up of what we looked at. So here in this roots, we can see the nodules. And then the average height was 26 inches. So that's pretty manageable to terminate. And then it really did close the canopy really well. There's no bare soil here and very few weeds. This gray is the cover crop. And how we took these measures above the canopy of the biomass and look down and do an assessment at multiple points in a plot. These are grasses. This is a triticale small plot. Grasses do fast initial growth, which is great because they can kind of outcompete weeds pretty rapidly by closing the canopy. They can have pretty high biomass. They can get pretty tall depending on the variety, which adds organic matter. But they can also, depending on when you terminate them, they can get kind of a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So they can also have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio depending on how much residual nitrogen you have in the soil and what time you terminate them. But if you are trying to increase nitrogen in your soil, grasses are not going to fix nitrogen. One other advantage is that the seed is relatively inexpensive. They do have fibrous roots, which will capture nitrate from depth in the profile, as well as prevent erosion. If you think of going to a sandy beach and that grass that's really like holding on for dear life, they're able to just kind of really grab and hold on to soil, which is great. And this is that triticale. When we terminated it, it was only 19 inches, so pretty low, actually. It hadn't really taken off yet. And there was a little bit more bare soil and a few more weeds. And then you can see this kind of fibrous root ball. Sometimes growers do have concerns with the fibrous root balls for termination. Some of them can get kind of bigger, like cereal rye. Mustards are brassicas. If you're growing in a garden environment, a lot of brassicas, you may not want to select this cover crop. We do want to always practice crop rotation, which is another soil health practice to increase microbial diversity and kind of break up pest pressure and mine nutrients from different depths of the profile. But in general, mustards are pretty great cover crops. They also produce a vigorous seedling. They do produce a higher biomass with a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than grasses. They have deeper tap roots, but they're not fibrous, so they can also capture a nitrate. But there are some IPM considerations in terms of rotation if you're planting other brassicas, though one IPM advantage with brassicas is that they do produce the same compound that's in a soil fumigant, metiam sodium, and so there has been some evidence that they can reduce disease pressure in soils. So it can be kind of a soil conditioner in that way of kind of keeping heavy pest pressure at bay. But that can be a little bit challenging to quantify as compared to a chemical application. And then when we're looking at this data from our small plots, this is that taproot that we're seeing. So this will be good to break up any compaction that's below the soil surface. It just kind of gets that taproot really in there. These are beautiful flowers where bees can come. However, brassicas, if you don't terminate them in time, can set, every little flower is going to set a seed and they'll fly out. They have these tiny little black seeds that will fly all around, and you will, actually that happened in my yard. I planted some brassicas, they went to seed, and I'm finding mustard everywhere for many years to come. So take care with that. I also wanted to talk about this daikon or forage radish, just to say that you can't believe everything you read on the internet. I would highly recommend, as much as possible, for variety selection and any resources on cover crops, to visit UC Cooperative Extension websites or the Plant Materials Center, USDA, or other RCD local resources. NCAT locally does stuff. There are a lot of NGOs. Your county RCD will have a lot of these resources as well, but really try to get local resources to understand this. I was always really fascinated by daikon radish or forage radish online. You know, you see these like amazing pictures of kids holding radishes that are like bigger than their bodies, and they call it tillage radish because it'll like work almost like tillage. This is what they'll say online: 12 to 20 inch thick fleshy taproot, goes down to 6 feet. It dies in the winter, the nitrogen is stored at these big channels, and it dries down the soil, and it's great for root growth. This is what it looked like in our small demo trials. Our roots were, you know, barely 6 inches, certainly not doing that same stuff. Now, the ones I saw at Lockford did look a lot better. So really kind of understanding our microclimates, how they work. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the cover crop information out there is from the Midwest right now. So I do think we have a group of people now in California who are really excited about doing this work. And so we'll have more and more local resources available. But just a word of caution as you're doing selection, as much as you can find a resource that's been produced in California or been at least vetted with our California conditions, the better, because we have much more specific growing systems than they do in some of the other regions where these resources are produced. So those are the winter cover crops. In terms of summer cover crops, some of the same things apply in terms of how much biomass do you want, what is your objective, what plant family do you want to select. This is a buckwheat and sun hemp cover crop field I had the opportunity to visit this past year. This is year 2 for the grower. The first year they planted the same mix, and they had some insects that came and just decimated the stand. He said within like a matter of, I want to say days, maybe weeks, but like ate the field down. But then they had extra seed, so they planted it again, and they had much more success. Sun hemp is a legume, fixes nitrogen, and then the buckwheat will produce a nice bee-friendly flower. This is on August 25th of this last summer. And then this is September 16th. Less than a month later, it really, really took off, and they got nice, you know, I would say about 3 feet of height before they terminated. Here's the picture of a bee here in this nice buckwheat flower. So I was really impressed 3 weeks later to see this huge change. And they did 2 irrigations. They seeded it. So it was coming out of wheat. They flamed the wheat residue, and then they drill seeded the cover crop right in. They irrigated it up after they seeded, and then they did another irrigation about 3 weeks later, and that's all they did, furrow irrigated. Irrigation twice in a hot summer here in the Sacramento Valley, and they got a beautiful summer cover crop stand. So I do think there are more opportunities for these non-rain fed cover crops if you do have the opportunity to irrigate in the summer, and you're coming out of wheat or something. You can really keep nice soil coverage through that fall, early fall. Here I am in a cornfield. This is a no-till project. This is a 6-species cover crop mix in there, including collards that the grower has interplanted in. So the idea is after they take the corn off, the cover crop takes off. This is another really innovative way you can cover crop in an annual system. We're in there with this white quadrant. We're taking soil coverage data as well here. I'm smiling, I don't know why. Cornfields are like humid and will cut your face. It was a little unpleasant, but it was so cool to see this system. And this is a kind of a third innovation in an annual system. You can do it when it's fallow, or you can try to interplant, and once you harvest, have it kind of take off. Okay, so to talk a little bit about what these annuals will do, this is the root zone of the legume. This is where it's fixing nitrogen, and I know that there have been other cover crop presentations that probably have covered this, so I'm just going to kind of fly through this, but this is where the magic is happening in the legume in these little nodules. Nitrogen availability is driven by different conditions, but mineralization is this conversion from organic nitrogen or plant material into plant available nitrogen. Plants can't just take up nitrogen, they require microbial conversion processes. C to N ratio, what that means is it's basically whether or not the material is higher in carbon and nitrogen as compared to the microbial body. And I think I'll actually talk about that in my next slide. And in terms of management for a legume, at flowering really is when you're having that peak nitrogen in the biomass. It can be challenging to wait to terminate our legumes at flowering because they may not flower before we need to get into the field. It depends on the year, but if possible, the recommendation is to cut at 75% bloom, especially if you're able to hand cut in a garden setting. 75% bloom is when you have that peak nitrogen fixed in there. You want to maximize your biomass, and you do want to inoculate, especially in year 1. The reason for the flowering is because if you think about it from the perspective of the plant, you know, and we think about our own nutrition, beans are high in protein, right? And protein is built from nitrogen. So the plant is fixing nitrogen, and then when it goes to set seeds and its little legume seeds, it's moving that nitrogen from its own biomass into the seeds, and those seeds are not going to break down to become available for later. So you really want to get it into the soil to feed your soil before that point. For carbon and nitrogen ratios, again, it all comes down to this ideal microbial diet, which is about 24:1. So legumes are below the ideal microbial diet. So what they're doing is they're almost like luxury eating. You know, they're sitting there, they're eating legumes, and they're spitting out nitrogen because there's more than what they need. As comparison, when they're eating a grass, this material has less nitrogen than what they need for their ideal diet. So they're pulling nitrogen out of the soil so that they can use that carbon in the grass. They want to get that carbon as their energy source. So that's what tying up nitrogen means when we talk about that idea with cover crops, ties up nitrogen. That just means that the microbes are selfishly using the nitrogen for their own biomass production of their own microbial community. And when that microbe dies, then that nitrogen gets released back in. So it's not lost from the system like volatilization or leaching is. It's just tied up for later. This cover crops can reduce nitrogen leaching regardless of the species, but the grasses and the brassicas with the deeper roots do more. Okay, so now some of the fun stuff from my research. This is on the left, vetch crops we had volunteer wheat coming up. And then on the right, this is just fallow, what we call the fallow control, but you can see it's not really fallow. There are quite a lot of weeds, but there is much more bare soil and then grasses. This is a different plot. This is vetch and then the vetch plus the wheat. So just kind of different views of this field. And this is how we collected that data. We put these quadrants down and we did a visual assessment and measurement. So in year one, the cedar was a little bit heavy that year. So our two treatments were, how do I go? Okay. Our two treatments were vetch at 70 pounds an acre and vetch at 140 pounds per acre as compared to our control. These blue sections are the vetch cover crop as compared to the volunteer wheat, which is not a bad thing to have in the field. People grow grasses again as a cover crop, so it's kind of like a mix. And then the red is bare soil and the blue is weeds. So the blue and the red is what we really don't want. We can see in the control, the blue and the red make up the majority of our pie graph as compared to with the vetch and the two rates of vetch. The volunteer wheat percentage is about the same, but most of that bare soil and weeds pressure is dominated by that vetch, which is great. This is year two. In year two, the cedar was a little more calibrated, so our rates were half that. They were lower, 35 and 70 pounds per acre. We didn't have volunteer wheat because it came up the year before, and so in the control, we just had weeds and bare soil. And again, we had the vetch really did reduce that heavy weed pressure in the treatment plots. However, these are some of my plots from this year. So this is a fava bean on the left and a balanza clover on the right. Here on the left, we see some favas and a lot of bare soil. And on the right, we see a lot of mustard, volunteer mustard weed coming up and very little clover. So I always like to kind of share information that I believe to be true. I believe cover crops can suppress weeds very effectively. I believe that in dry years, it can be hard to get a good cover crop stand in our climate. And so I'm hoping some of these will bounce back a little bit, but some of them will close the canopy better than others. And it's a little dicey when we have our dry fall conditions as we did this year. Just to talk a little bit briefly about the environment, cover crops do reduce the amount of water that runs off. This is work done in an orchard situation, but it's relevant for annual systems as well. In this data, they found that this is data from another farm advisor, Dr. Zalem, and 40 to 80% reduction in gallons of runoff in February when the rain was steady, and 10 to 20% reduction in January when the rain was heavy. This is planted versus native, means planted with a cover crop versus weeds. There was no difference. So weeds do serve some of those same water dynamic benefits. This is to show the difference that a month makes. So here we see the same field. This is March 18th when we did our original biomass measurements, and this is a month later when the grower actually terminated, 3 weeks later, almost a month. And you can see really that warm 3 weeks made a huge difference. So see, the wheat is kind of at the same height in both pictures, but here the vetch has like really grown up and done a great job. In this graph, I'll show this is what this data is. So this is the heavy rate of the vetch, the 140 pounds seeded, and this is the 70 pounds as compared to our control. The field rate is the T1 rate of 70 pounds per acre. And so this is on 318 versus 416. So a month later, the nitrogen increased by almost 4x to 271 pounds per acre, and the carbon increased almost 5 times in that last month of growth. So giving the cover crop the opportunity to really flourish and to produce that biomass, in a month, we can see a huge difference. So there's still hope for this year. We may have this kind of slow start, especially things like vetch will kind of go off to the races a little bit later in the spring as it gets a little warmer. So, and then in terms of equipment to manage cover crops and some of those considerations, these are some pictures from a field day that we had with some equipment. This is one of the, I think, big challenges with cover crops in annual systems is kind of like, how do I get in there and terminate them? What equipment can I use? So we talked about some standard equipment. This is a Lopez culture shed. It's for spring termination with light cover crop conditions, so you want low biomass, not very stringy. So if you have like a giant brassica that's gotten really stringy and woody, it's probably not a heavy duty enough for that. It has a double coulter blade. It cuts the material and lightly mixes it in. It also has a lawnmower style roller on the back, which kind of mixes in the residue and levels the bed off. It does not work well in wet conditions, and you can drive it between 4 and 6 miles per hour. This is all from a resource I put together, equipment to manage cover crops in annual rotations. You can find that on my UC website. We showcase 9 pieces of equipment. Some are more specialized, specific for cover crops, and some are more common. We tried to kind of run the gamut of equipment that you might already have if you were growing annual commodities, and then others that you might either purchase or think about, using if you wanted to kind of get more deep into the cover crops. One main thing with using equipment for cover crops is really try not to overwork that field and that soil, because the more we till and disturb our soil, the more we're kind of diminishing our soil health advantage from the cover crop. So we want to grow the cover crop, try to get that biomass, available for the microbes, but not really do like a deep tillage or a huge amount of disturbance. Really try not to overwork it. Do not work the soil when it is wet. Resist the temptation to do that, even in your garden. Okay, so I saw that first question about backyard gardening, I think it was, or something small scale. So I put this slide in as we were doing the introductions. This is a piece of equipment I bought. It was about $1,000. It's a push planter. I use this to plant my single row plants. I highly would recommend it if you are not at a tractor scale of production. It worked really well. It has a little seed hopper here. You can keep it pretty easy. You can put the little foot, so it'll bury seeds at different depths, and it has something that'll close the seed line at the end. Here are 2 of my awesome technicians planting out one of our plots, and just a little plug for that. It's called a junior planet planter. And then I know I'm close to my time here, but I did want to just share quickly about another project we're doing around the state. This is in organic production specifically. We have 5 growers involved who are trying really innovative reduced tillage work and incorporating cover crop into that work. And so it can be very challenging to do reduced tillage in organic or in conventional. It's just very challenging in general in California because we have a high biomass, fast production system. We don't have that kind of cold, hard frost in the winter. But the more and more I understand reduced disturbance and the more data comes out, it really does seem like as much as we can reduce our tillage, minimize where we till, that's really where we're building our soil health. This is in collaboration with the UC. We have some USDA folks on it, as well as some people from Chico State, the Regenerative Ags and Resilient Systems there. And this is our group here at a field site down in Hollister. And at the different, I have to really commend the growers working with us on this. They're really taking a lot of risks to try out these innovative pieces of equipment and systems, trying to figure out how to do strip tillage, how to do grazing to terminate cover crops, and then how to, really keep that soil covered year round. And you can see in these pictures, we have a lot more residue in our beds than normal. So normally in my area, people talk about having clean beds or not having trash in the beds. In this project, we're experimenting with trying to keep more residue on top and see how that works out. So, oh, and then a quick plug for my YouTube channel. I have the Soil Health Connection with my local RCD. This is the Executive Director, Liz Harper. She's my co-host. This is Cindy Daly. She's a livestock and soil health expert in Chico State. And we do really fun stuff like make soil demo videos. So check us out. We're on YouTube. And it is a cool collaboration between UC and the RCD. And then if you are interested in cover crops, please check out the Western Cover Crop webpage. We are a little bit new, so we're still building up our resources, but stay in touch with our group if you want to kind of keep in touch. When we can meet in person again, we will have conferences. We may do something virtual depending on how long this continues to go on. So, oh, okay, no, I'm just kidding. These are my last slides. So the Soil Health Institute, to do a quick plug, they are awesome. And if you're interested in soil health and cover crops, highly recommend you loop in and look at their website. They have done a tremendous amount of work to try to understand how we can measure soil function, to tie back to that definition of soil health, how we can measure soil function relatively easily and quickly in our farms and our gardens. They developed a model with soil organic carbon, percent silt, and percent clay that can predict available water holding capacity pretty accurately, which is amazing. And then they also did this work around aggregate stability. And so basically there are different indicators of soil health, and some of them are more or less difficult to measure. Available water holding capacity is particularly difficult to measure. It involves collecting these cores in the field intact, and it's just pretty involved. So to be able to model it with a soil test that has percent soil organic carbon, silt, and clay is pretty amazing. With regards to aggregate stability, they evaluated 5 ways to measure, 4 of which are quite tedious. Most commercial labs won't even do those assessments. And they compared them to an app that you can get on your iPhone, or any phone, actually, any smartphone, called the Slake's app. It actually works reasonably well. They found that it is very effective for quantifying aggregate stability. For you, me, agronomists, commercial labs, etc. Aggregate stability is a really great indicator of soil health. It's a physical characteristic that's really driven by soil biology and influenced by chemistry, and it represents the diversity of architecture and pore space, which is kind of important because the big pores are where we have water moving during rain events, and the small pores is where we have our water being held for later on for our plant uptake. So we kind of want to have this diverse pore space in our soil. So just a plug for that. And with that, I wanted to thank my grower collaborators, the CDFA, for funding my work, and then my colleagues at the UC who are working on this. And Gene Meow is also involved, and I'm sorry, his name's not on the slide. So thank you so much. I'm glad to take questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that excellent tour of so many aspects of cover cropping. And I can say, certainly speak for myself, and I'm sure for many of our participants would agree that one of the most exciting parts is the research that you're doing, and I'm looking forward to more. Also, for folks, we actually linked that resource, that newsletter article that Sarah referred to several times, and that's both in the flyer and in the emails confirmations that you got. So definitely check that out. It's a really great resource.
Thank you.
We will move into questions, and I'm gonna start out Sonia's question, and that you already kind of addressed, but I'd like to interpret her question, which is about, growing crops in the same or different spots and how that affects things. I'd like to ask you how you regard cover cropping in the context of crop rotation, and is the cover crop considered a rotation? Can you go from tomatoes to cover crop to tomatoes and consider that a rotation, or with any other crop, or is it just a complement and rotation should be considered kind of separately?
So certainly from a soil perspective, a cover crop is a rotation in the sense that you're introducing a different, so if we think about the benefits of crop rotation, crop rotation will break disease pressure because a lot of pathogens and pests are, preferentially will be hosts on certain plants. So a cover crop, especially one that's in a different plant family, certainly will provide that rotational benefit. If you think about difference, another cover crop, a crop rotation benefit is having different rooting depths. And so you're kind of like stimulating the soil in different depths of the profile and mining nutrients at different depths of the profile, exuding root exudates at different depths of the profile. Certainly that benefit will be accomplished with a cover crop. Now, would I recommend rotation with tomatoes, cover crop, tomato? No, I wouldn't recommend that. I think ideally you will rotate. I think that's better than never rotating out of tomato at all, but ideally, if you can, you would have a little bit of a more complex rotation. There are growers in my area who talk about fields being over tomatoed. So I think, you may be able to get by doing that for years actually, but you may run into problems down the road. So I think as much as we can diversify our systems and even do tomatoes every year, that's every other year, that's better. But yeah, so they have some of the same benefits of a crop rotation, but it's not, you know, it's not going to be long enough to necessarily do it all. But to be honest, you know, a lot of our soil pathogens can reside in the soil for decades. So using crop rotation to manage them isn't realistic anyway. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes and no. Mostly yes.
Yeah.
I'll say yes.
It's a complicated thing, but I think discussing the principles is a good place to start. And I think for Sonia's question, it sounds like, you know, rotating things around even a small area is better, and cover crops can be part of that strategy.
Is this in a garden situation, right?
This would be in a garden situation, but I was also expanding it to kind of a larger consideration too.
Yeah, I think as much as we can. I mean, as I always say, there's the reality in which we want to live and the reality in which we do live, and they're not the same. And so I think as much as we can rotate, take advantage of all the land we have, and just those different benefits, that's great too. In terms of like weed control, weed pressure, you know, tomatoes in a commercial setting you may not be able to control certain weeds as well in a tomato stand, and a cover crop's not going to help you with that if it's grown in the winter and the tomatoes there every summer. So there may be some practical advantages to having rotation as well, in terms of like corn will come in and out compete the weeds, or some other kind of agronomic benefit. So
excellent. I agree. You know, and I think that the key there is to really learn the principles and then be able to apply them. There's always the kind of give and take. I'm going to skip over one question real quick, and go, since we were talking about tomatoes, Paul Lum asks how much cover crop research is being done with processing tomatoes, and how much adoption of cover cropping is there among processing tomato growers? And I'll add to that question, and particularly getting into the field early is a concern for a lot of processing tomato growers. So maybe I can tack that on.
Yeah, so the data that I showed from our trial with Amber Vinkesi-Ball, her program is mostly with processing tomatoes. So that project was in a 3-year rotation with field crops and processing tomatoes. I personally don't have processing tomatoes in my program, but they're commonly grown in rotation with the crops in my program. So a lot of my cover crop trials do have processing tomatoes in one of the years of the 3-year study. That's very common. In fact, I think for all 3 of my trials. In terms of how common it is, I wouldn't say it's more or less common than other annual cropping systems at this point. I think cover crops have been slower to be adopted in California in general because of some of the production challenges. And so in tomatoes, it's similar. With regards to that plant date, that certainly can be a consideration. And in fact, in that year when I showed the biomass that really took off in that last month, I believe that their plant date was like April 15th. And then of course, April 18th was when the cover crop was huge. So, but it was fine. I mean, we took yield data from the tomatoes. There was no negative impact, and it was an organic field. So I think it worked out okay, but certainly that is a risk of having cover crops in general, is that you may or may not be able to get in there as you need to. I think that personally, I believe that cover crops are a huge advantage to can be a huge advantage to any production system and provide a lot of soil health benefits. I think that we're in a time with a lot of uncertainty around our climate. And so we're going to just kind of have to be easy with ourselves around some of these concerns. In terms of when, like the rain may come late, and having a cover crop there may help you have the field dry down a little bit faster. So it's kind of hard to say like every year as a rule of thumb what's going to happen. But certainly there are, the projects that I'm working on all include processing tomatoes as one of the cash crops. So.
Great, thank you. And you know, I think the impression I get the more I listen to experts in cover crops is that there's a lot of art to it, because of so many dynamic factors. So it's something that, you know, has a lot of benefits, but it is something that there's no substitute for experience, right? Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the projects I have is looking at soil moisture dynamics with and without cover crops. And these are such complicated questions, but, in terms of the really some of the really experienced cover crop growers that I know who use cover crops in annual rotations will kind of decide when to terminate out based on how wet or dry the year has been too, and how much moisture they want to maintain. Because if you have a really wet spring, the cover crop will help with the water infiltration and moving the water through the profile and all that stuff. But if you have a really dry spring, the cover crop basically is like sucking up moisture and using it. And so that's kind of like really trying to think about that system. And I don't want to say a cover crop needs to be managed as much as a cash crop, because that makes it sound like it's a lot more work. It doesn't need to be managed necessarily. Our cash crops, we're looking at pests and insects and when are we going to time the harvest. But I think thinking about our cover crop within the nuances of our system every year is going to be to your advantage. And to go back to that initial slide, it really depends on what you're trying to get out of it. And that is can really drive variety. But certainly, the drier wetness of the spring, those factors are things that can't be predicted, but should be considered when you're making termination choices.
Just to make sure we don't discourage any newcomers, any tips? We've just talked about some of the challenges, but any tips for beginners in terms of how to get started and to kind of manage risk when you're just starting to learn about these things?
Yeah, I think it's always better to start in a small area than not at all. And if you want to see how stuff works with your equipment, do your own strip trial. Buy 4 different, single species or mixes, plant them out in one row of your cedar and see what happens. The CDFA, I don't know what will happen next year, but the CDFA, EQIP, there are some pretty great programs out there to help offset some of those costs that can help make it just a little bit easier to start a new practice. I know the RCDs and UCCE are doing work around technical assistance around that. It sounds like you guys have a really great team in your area who can help you with that type of stuff. So contact your local experts. But I would say, you taking it as an opportunity to kind of experiment and see what works for you. And then in terms of, thinking about what equipment you already have, like, the worst thing would be that you plant a cover crop and then you don't have the right thing to terminate it later. So I would just think through the termination piece and definitely check out that equipment resource if you want to think about what might work in your system, or talk to your neighbors who may have done cover cropping, or to your local experts. And that would be my suggestion, would just be like, start small and try a few things at once, but don't get like too crazy with the mixes at once, because you want to see what's working. And and don't work the soil when wet. That's my other main tip.
Ben Weiss will at the end of this presentation actually talk more about the programs, the CDFA and the equipment grants that Sarah just referred to. So please stay with us, and we'll talk about those, which are really opportunities for cost share and to get some of the costs of getting started covered. Real quick, because there was a question about termination, the term termination, and for those who have less experience with cover crops, can you talk more about what termination means? And I'm going to throw in there also the question about organic, so because some important differences there. So if you can address those.
Yeah, sure. So termination means to end the life of the cover crop, to kill it. In some systems, their climate may participate more in that process than in ours. In ours, the cover crop will just kind of keep going. It'll set seed, and its natural senescence will likely happen after the point at which you want to get into the field to do something, to grow something else. So termination just means to kind of terminate that cover crop. In terms of the difference between organic and conventional, of course, in organic, there aren't as many herbicide options. So in conventional, you may just have more opportunities for things that can be sprayed as either as a desiccant or as something to actually kill the cover crop. Although my understanding with herbicides is that they're more effective really when the plants are like under 6 inches. So really the cover crop biomass, you are not going to get great efficacy and control with a chemical, but in organic, you don't even have those options. So, so I guess, yeah, in conventional, one of the opportunities would be to use a herbicide or a desiccant to kind of get that material down. And in organic, you have to either chop it, cut it, something like that. So, and that publication on equipment is basically all about managing, a lot of it is about terminating, so.
Do you want to say maybe just a few words about the differences between just chopping and actually disking cover crop in?
Sure, yeah, so so if you think about like a, let's say a 3 foot tall vetch stand, and you want to like really get that in there so the microbes can eat it. So you could cut it, and chopping it will basically cut the plant material into smaller pieces, and then disking is like the physical incorporation into the soil. So that's where you want to kind of take care to not overdo it, because if you overwork your soil, you may destroy your soil structure further than the cover crop is adding a benefit. So as much as you can kind of just gently, if you think about microbes, they're very small, they don't have a lot of energy, and they can't like really move, like they're really, their energy is like eating and dying. So when we disturb them and we provide a lot of stress for them, they lose their capacity to do the work we need them to do or to function for us. So that's why when we terminate, we just want to kind of gently incorporate it if at all. Another consideration around termination would be your irrigation system. So if you have like drip tape, of course, you don't want to damage that. But if you're furrow irrigating or something like that, there are challenges with having a lot of cover crop residue in the furrows because you won't be able to move water as rapidly across the field. So that's why it's really kind of a system by system specific, those considerations, I guess.
Right, and as I understand also the crop choices, like you mentioned, the difference between legumes and grasses where you have different levels of biomass accumulation.
Yeah, and then as well, the ease of incorporation can be different. So like something like a vetch will get, may get taller or a little stringy, but it's not going to get as, it's not going to get really stringy like a grass. Like as grasses start to dry down, they get that kind of fibrous in the leaf. Same with the brassica, it gets that like thick stalk that can just be challenging with equipment. And so, and then takes longer to break down is the other thing. The microbes can't really get at it as much. So yeah, I would say the easier it is for you to kind of get rid of it, probably the easier it is too for the microbe to eat it in some way. It takes them longer to break more complex compounds.
Yes. To kind of shift a question that really is asking about establishment rather than termination, and about kind of how do you try to make sure you have a successful cover crop when you are not irrigating, which is, I'd say, in most cases in systems. Any tips or thoughts on and about how folks deal with the differences in winter rainfall and cover crop establishment?
You know, some growers I know who have been cover cropping for a long time will seed their cover crop pretty early in the fall, and then just like it'll germinate with the first rain. I think trying to like really time it around the rain event is gonna add, it depends on your, I work in more larger production systems potentially, but I would say in a larger production system, just like seeding when you have the opportunity and then hoping that you don't have a 1 inch of rain and then a dry 6 weeks so that the seed germinates and dies is a good practice. Of course, it really depends on what other work you have to do, but trying to plant after the first rain can be really dicey because certainly the soil structure dangers from driving over a wet field are high. That's how you get our subsurface compaction issues and rutting and stuff like that. So those should be avoided. So I would say for a fall planted cover crop, trying to really get that seed in the ground when you have the opportunity is great. And there's no assurance though that then we'll get any rain or adequate rain, to keep it up. So those are the risks. But there's no disadvantage to putting it in the ground. It's not like something's going to happen to the seed if it's planted when it's dry. It'll just kind of hang out and wait for moisture. And drill seeding, I should say drill seeding is I would recommend drill seeding if you can, to answer that question. Because you're getting the seed good. You want to get good seed to soil contact. So if you put it on top, then that's when the birds will kind of eat it or it'll bounce around. But if you put it, you drill seed it in, then you get good seed to soil contact. It waits for moisture and then it comes up. So most people use a Great Plains drill in my area for that.
Great point. Although I was really fascinated by that interseeding kind of with the corn crop, which I imagine that was not drilled, or was it?
I think they did drill seed that, yeah. I think they drill seeded it. And I don't know if they drill seeded it when the corn was like short. I can't remember exactly what they did, but I think they did. I can't think of how else they would have planted it,
But that sounds like a nice way to try to get kind of a more assured establishment, kind of earlier.
The drill seeding?
Well, and the intercropping is an interesting, because you're presumably possibly still watering and there's some kind of shading possibly going on that will help establishment.
I did see, well, so I think intercropping is like, if you can get it to work right, it's great. I think it can sometimes be like a more intriguing idea than reality in some way, because I did see one field that was intercropped. I believe it was clover with wheat, and like the wheat just totally shaded up the clover. Yeah, I believe that's what it must have been. And the clover just kind of never did anything. Now with that corn situation, the cover crop was going to kind of like, the idea was that it was going to jump up at the end after the corn comes off. And then of course the corn's being irrigated in the summer, but if the drip tape is buried below where the root zone of the cover crop is. So I think interplanting, again, is something you would want to experiment with on a small scale in your system first and just see how it works. And if you can get it to work, it's awesome, because you can truly keep a living root all the time without any break, because even with a cover crop, you're harvesting your tomato, let's say, or your corn, let's say in like August or September, and then you're seeding your cover crop and you're waiting for fall rain. So that might not really come up, and it's certainly not going to close a canopy or develop a root zone until like December, January. So you do still have that kind of fallow field. I mean, it would come up before January, but it's really going to develop those benefits a little later. But with intercropping, it's done that hard work of like germinating, kind of getting a little established, and then once it has the space to breathe, it can be off to the races. So that's one of the really big advantages of that. Yeah.
Great. I'll be excited to hear more about the work in that area. A couple of questions. One is about an organic olive orchard and another about grapes in Southern California. I will first say, please join us and look on our homepage for this for the cover cropping opportunities in specialty crops. We have webinars specifically for orchards and vineyards coming up, so we'd love to have you join us for those. But if you care to say a few words, Sarah, about how things might work in an organic olive orchard or in a Southern California vineyard, but even just focusing on the difference between climate in different parts of the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what to say much past plant something that'll work in your climate. I'm not as familiar with the, I'm familiar with Southern California climate, but not as much with the cover crop opportunities there with regards to the climate. For vineyards, so there are 2 UC resources that I'll recommend. One for annual crops, which is cover cropping and vegetable cropping systems. It's a book. You can buy it on the UCANR publications page. And then there's one for vineyards specifically as well. In a perennial system like a vineyard or an olive orchard or any other orchard, one of the benefits and advantages that you have with cover cropping is that you can plant either a perennial cover crop, which I didn't talk about in this because I was really focusing on annual systems. But so in an annual system, you want to plant like an annual cover crop because you want to then use that space for something else. But in something with trees or vines, where you're planting in between, you have even more options for variety selection because you can select either a cover crop that will grow as a perennial. In other words, it doesn't ever die down, or something that's called I think they call it a permanently reseeding annual. So there's like certain clovers that will basically like reseed themselves. And so you don't have to do that work of like buying seed every year, replanting every year. So I highly would recommend for a perennial system to try to look into some of those variety opportunities, because some of the work around management that we've talked about today may not even be stuff you have to worry about at all.
Thank you. So for those of you with us still, please feel free to put more questions in the question and answer box. Again, you can access that at the bottom toolbar Q&A. I had a question, Sarah, which for those just getting started, we know that cover cropping really is a practice that the benefits of which kind of accumulate over the years, and sometimes a lot of folks believe that you got to kind of do it for a while to start to see the benefits. What are, in your opinion, some of the benefits that show up sooner and can be counted on sooner, and what are things that kind of come with time? I know kind of the drying out the field was one of the good ones that I think is an immediate benefit, but.
Great question. Some of the immediate benefits in season that you can realize are for sure weed suppression and weed control, because they'll just outshade and outcompete your weeds, prevent weeds from going to seed. Another immediate benefit is with regards to water infiltration and reduced surface compaction, because the cover crop is just kind of helping that water get into the surface of the soil right away. And then a third would be providing residue cover and reducing erosion risk. Another immediate benefit is that you, in year 1, are going to have food for your microbes available, which is great. One thing we talk about with cover crops is breaking the carbon boom bust cycle. So if you think about it from a microbe, they're like, they're eating in abundance when our cash crops are growing, and then they're like starving when there's nothing there in the fallow. And some of our pathogens are the ones that can really just hang out with no food for a long time, and then they're ready to go anytime, and the microbes that we want may not have that same capability. So those are some of the immediate benefits. In terms of like long-term, certainly those soil structure benefits, increasing our percentage of soil carbon. In terms of like some of the disease benefits, some of them are realized sooner than others, but some of them can take longer. And then more of the bigger structural in terms of aggregate stability, water holding capacity, water flow when the soil is saturated. Those are ones that are going to take longer to realize because they are building soil health.
Super. Thank you. A comment from Grace from CDFA. No-till and drill seeding benefit cover crop establishment. You addressed, I think, some of that. And then another question, what was the name of that $1,000 device that you were using for drill seeding?
I believe it's called a Junior Planet push planter. And I got it from Valley Tractor Supply. They're they have locations throughout California, and they were able to source it for me, and they actually did roadside assistance when we first used it. And I was like, okay, you came out for a very small piece of equipment. I'm impressed. So very helpful.
Wonderful.
And that can be used, I think people are using it for like seeding all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's not just for cover crops. You know, you can use it for not tomatoes, but anything you wouldn't plant as a transplant. Anything you would seed could be used with it. It has different seed plate sizes, so.
Super. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us today and giving us this very informative presentation and interview. And I've kind of switched to our conclusion slide. Unless there's any further questions from any attendees or the panelists, once again, I thank Sarah, and a round of applause in this Zoom environment, you can imagine.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really fun to be here, so thank you for including me in your series.
I'd like to pass it to Ben Weiss, who we promised would talk a little bit about the programs that they offer support on that you can take advantage of to get going with cover cropping. And then, so I'll pass it on to Ben.
Yeah. And Sarah, there's someone in the chat asking for your contact information, if you want to drop it in there. But Sarah mentioned it earlier, talking about the state's Healthy Soils Program and then the NRCS EQIP program. That's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. We're still waiting to hear what the Healthy Soils Program is going to look like this year. There was a line item in the governor's proposed budget, so we feel pretty good about that, but we'll see what actually shakes out. So stay tuned on that. That the Healthy Soils Program is a cost share program that'll help put cover crops out on your field, provide funding, get you guys hooked up that way. So if you're interested in learning more about that, keep an eye on your emails. And then also just get in contact with myself. I put my contact information at the top. I'll drop it here again and chat in just a second. Or Derek, we're both here to help, and we want to get cover crops out there with you. And then to talk really briefly about the federal opportunity, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, we're actually in an EQIP batching period right now. The deadline, I believe, is March 3rd. So if you are interested in that, do not delay. Please contact me. I'll put you in touch with, her name is Clarimer Hernandez. She's the district conservationist here in Contra Costa County, and you can start the processing and all that. But if that's too soon and you still have some questions and you want to learn more, there will be another EQIP batching deadline in this summer. I believe it's in June. But at the very least, you should get in contact with Clarimer, get in contact with myself. We're happy to talk more with you outside of a webinar, and actually maybe site visit, and get to know your operations and see how cover crops could be a good fit there. So I'll drop my contact information in the chat here in just a second. Thanks for Sarah for presenting, and thanks Conrad for hosting. I'll pass it on to whoever's next.
Thank you very much, Ben. So, I forgot to mention, somebody also asked, we have recorded and we will be posting this webinar on the East Bay Crop Production YouTube channel under the Cover Cropping Opportunities playlist. So please do look for it there. And you can find it at kind of information about upcoming and links to our previous recorded webinars at the homepage you see at the bottom right there. ucanr.edu/covercropscoco. With that, also please, you should see an evaluation open in your browser when we conclude this webinar. We are very grateful that you fill that out so that we can continue to bring great and suitable programming to you. So thanks everyone. Thanks again, Sarah. Thanks everyone else who participated in organizing this. Ben, Rob, Julio, and Derek. And hope to see you again soon for our upcoming webinars. Anyone want to say anything else?
Thanks so much.
All the best, and until next time.